anyways, let's dive into the Bible and the series of Esther that we've been looking at. We are in week 2 of our Esther series, and we're talking. The series is called Esther and the Invisible God. Esther and the Invisible God. And to give you some context to this book, it was written during the time of the Israelite exile, with the reign of King Xerxes of Persia, so somewhere between 486 BC and 480 BC, so somewhere in that time frame is the story. And the story is unique because it displays God's providence and sovereignty in a way that we don't normally see in Scripture. It's full of irony and unique literary patterns. It's actually parts of it that you'll find ironic to the point of laughter, and that you're supposed to kind of think a little bit of a comedic way in some of these areas. It's also exceptionally dark in other areas as well, so it's a very unique book. It's a story where God is invisible because he's never mentioned or even referred to throughout the entirety of the book, which there's no other book of the Bible like that, where God isn't mentioned or even referred to indirectly within the story, talking about how even when he isn't mentioned, he is still there working providentially. And last week we looked at kind of the two main takeaways of the first chapter, where it teaches us that it recognizes how what God sees as foolishness, a lot of times the world champions as greatness, right? If you guys remember the breakdown of Xerxes' Persian kingdom, it was grand and wealthy and abundant and beautiful, all the things that we would imagine is successful and wonderful in this world. Yet when we get to the end of the chapter, the irony is God thinks these things are foolish. And the way that he exposes that through Queen Vashti is again, ironic and supposed to make us laugh a little bit about this. And Queen Vashti is one who refuses to go before the king and his nobles unclothed, only wearing her crown. She refuses to be objectified in that way, so the king gets angry, the nobles get angry, they're in a drunken stir, they make this law that says now all wives and women must obey their husbands as rulers. Out of this kind of fear and paranoia, they come with this legislation, and it kind of leads into this exposure of wealth and power, that even though Xerxes had all the power, the wealth, the material in the world, it didn't give him this lasting security. That his wife just telling him no really shook the foundations of all the things that Xerxes thought was great. And we learn that the more power you have, the more fear you have to lose it, and the greater harm on others you'll wield in order to keep it. And God thinks this is foolish. The fool does this. And then also we looked at how, while God may be silent and hidden, that doesn't imply his absence. While God is maybe silent and hidden in the story, that doesn't imply his absent. That when Queen Vashti refused this great king, we look at this as God's work, as God's hand in the story. Her refusal to stand objectified before a group of drunk men is God exposing an evil situation behind the scenes, silently and quietly. At the same time, he opens doors for a larger plan that is yet to be seen within the story, the rescuing of his people, which is how the story continues. That even a drunk Xerxes objectifying his wife will not hinder God in moving his good plan forward. We saw that in the first chapter. And then we kind of looked at the idea of sometimes God will feel far away and maybe even feel silent in our lives. I think we've all been through seasons where you're kind of wondering where God is. Is he quiet? Is he still there? But we learned that even in those seasons, that we're not even for a moment do we think that he's ever absent, that he is still moving our lives forward, that it may just be chapter 1 of the story of our new direction with the Lord. So today we're going to introduce Esther. Today we're going to introduce the character of Esther, the heroine of the story. And I do need to warn you, this is could be a triggering message for some of you. And if you're if you're new to real life, I just want you to hear this. You know, we're not afraid to talk about real things. It's kind of implied in the name. If we don't do that, we are the biggest hypocrites on the block. And we do dive into some real things. These are real situations in people's lives. But it could be difficult, and sometimes it is hard. In fact, I have gotten emails from people before over the years that say we shouldn't talk about these things in church. Well, I don't know where else to talk about them, if not in places like this. So today we're going to talk about Esther. We're going to read about her introduction in Esther chapter 2. So let's just read her story. It's about 18 verses. So as my dad used to say, long passage, short sermon. So that could be the true. We'll find out. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in Esther chapter 2. We're going to read 1 through 18, just following what happened in chapter 1 here. It says, later when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. I'm sure it did. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew in the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive was Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants to the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman's term came to go to King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. This is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her and given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem of the care of Shagaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, in the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any other woman, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. You know, the Apostle John will tell us in John chapter 1 of his prelude, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And this is a line that I often think about and reflect on in my own life. And John's line here, referring to Jesus' incarnation into the world and everything that will lead to, I think equally connects to Old Testament stories such as Esther's. That the Lord isn't afraid to enter into dark circumstances in order to meet those who are immersed in them and then to bring them through to different purposes. And I think this is exactly what we see with the story of Esther in these opening chapters. Because Esther's story, when we really examine what is going on in this story, it is a dark situation for this young girl. I would say systemic sexual exploitation of innocent girls is never something that we should just gloss over, especially in these first introduction to Esther, who is a victim of this situation. And I think this is exactly the difficulty of studying books like this or messages like this is it forces us to confront some really difficult things, not only maybe things we've experienced, but systems that we may also participate in. And I think we see that with this collection of young virgin girls. We looked at in chapter 1, and it tells us in the opening lines that Xerxes ruled a kingdom or an empire of 127 provinces. 127 provinces, which means that there were officials assigned to all those provinces looking for young virgin girls to bring to Susa to join his harem. And if we look at the historical context of this, it disturbs us even further, as these young virgin girls were no more than 12 to 16 years old. Scholars agree that these were 12 to 16-year-old girls, Esther being included in this. And the numbers have varied historically. We have a first-century Jewish writer named Josephus that estimates there are about 400 young virgin girls taken to Susa, but there are also numbers as high as 1,000. Imagine being a family member of these girls, being taken from their homes all over the world and taken into a foreign place for the pleasure of some king. All these young girls must have been a variety of different emotions, but all there to please a king in the most perverse and disturbing of ways. Today we call this systemic sexual trafficking. But this is exactly the life and the world that Esther experienced, and her introduction to the story, I think, is important as we look at this. Because Esther was one of those who was lakah. It's this, lakah can mean, Hebrew word, it's a Hebrew word for like accepted or brought to, but I think in Esther's case, and most of these girls' case, the best English word for that is probably seized. It can also mean seized and taken to the king's palace. That our heroine of the story, the one who named this book, or the reason we know this book, Esther, it begins with her being part of a victim of sexual exploitation. And I think, again, this is a really important part of this story. As we think about her situation, as we think about the characters in this story and where the story is going to go. And again, as we looked at last week, this story is highly relevant to our world today. We live in a world of wealth, power, influence, beauty, where all those things are magnified and heightened to the highest extreme. And even today, we looked at statistics, and it's not hard to find that 53% of women in the United States are victims of some kind of sexual assault. 80% of those are under the age of 18. The world of Esther is not that much different than ours. And that should make us pause. In fact, even being up here talking about this is exceptionally hard. Just feeling all of your eyes on me as we talk about this is not easy. But again, this is Esther's story. This means that half of this room, potentially, can relate to Esther's experiences in some way or another. While over 2,000 years separate Esther from us, we're still dealing with the same face of evil. We're still dealing with the same wickedness that put Esther into this situation. It's darkness, where we're forced to wrestle with the question, where is God and why does he seem invisible? Why would he allow this to happen? That potentially 1,000 young girls taken from their homes for some king's objectification and pleasure. Where is God in this kind of exploitation? And I think this is a common question and a good question to ask. And I think it sets up our understanding of Esther really well when we do think about those questions. And the author of Esther, I think, is really pointing us to these types of questions. That we don't get God's thoughts and take on these types of things directly. But he wants us to be thinking about these things and who she is as she goes into the rest of her story. So we're going to talk a little bit about those questions because they are tough questions, but questions that are important to look at. But here's some things that the Bible teaches us about that. And I'm not going to give a simple answer, a boxed answer, but all I can give you is other things that the Bible has to say about that. Well, the first one I think is important. God did not want this to happen to Esther. God did not want this to happen to Esther. We have a lot of verses that will reaffirm that God does not like these things to occur. He does not wish these things to occur. He does not desire for these things to occur. Look at 1 John 2:16. It says, "For all that is in the world, The desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. Lamentations 3:33, the book of mourning, says this, "For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone." For he willingly does not bring affliction or grief to anyone. What victims like Esther, and I think half of the women in the United States experience, is so far from God's good desire for his world. It is a foreign thing to his mind and his wishes because of the brokenness and the sinfulness of it. It points really more to the fact that we are far from his presence than if we are closer in this world. That Eden feels like a foreign environment to us. There is nothing in the Bible that could ever persuade me to think that God would determine and desire the sexual exploitation of young girls and God would approve of that. Zero. It's counter to everything we know about God's good, loving character. I think exploitations like this grieve God deeply. And I would say he mourned deeply through this experience of watching this occur. I think God mourned the situation, that he's mourned the sufferings of his own people. Like in Jeremiah 8:21, the prophet says this, he's mirroring the reflections of God as the prophet. And he says, "Since my people are crushed, I am crushed. I mourn and horror grips me." I think that would basically summarize what he is experiencing with Esther in these situations, as well as all of his people who are in exile during this time. I believe God mourned at Esther's situation, the exploitation of all of these innocent young girls across the empire. I think he grieves for those who are victims just as Esther was. I think that leads into a kind of the idea of what God's justice really is. Because I know it might feel, or maybe he still feels, as if God abandoned you in that particular situation. Again, this is a key point of the story of Esther, is just because he is silent and hidden does not mean he is absent. But I've sat with many people who have gone through things like this, where their first reaction is, God has abandoned me. And it may not even be this severe. It could be just other things that you've lost where you feel like God has abandoned you or that he was absent. But stories like Esther, especially in the beginning part of her story, as we get to know her better, we learn that it was far from the truth that he ever abandoned you. But God saw it. He experienced it with you, and his justice is coming. While his sword may remain sheathed for the moment, a day will come when the unrepentant perpetrators of things like this, things like exploitation of young girls, will answer to their crimes. This is a huge facet of the gospel. The diamond that we call the gospel, a facet is that all the wrongdoings that have been done to his people and his creation will soon be righted for eternity in perpetuity. A day where they will all be held accountable to those things that they have done, that we all have done. And a day where those who were like Esther exploited will one day find healing in fullness. As followers of Jesus, we believe that our resurrected King, our Jesus, will return and bring perfect justice, perfect rightness to his creation. As Revelation will teach us, when our faithful and true King will return and right all the wrongs of injustice and rule the world in perfect righteousness. That is the future and the hope for us who hold and follow Jesus. Is that we can look into the world and we recognize things like this as deeply unjust, deeply corrupt and wicked and evil. And we look around and we go, where is God in all of this? Yet in his timing, we see that there will be a time when some will be able to be held accountable in this world. But others, we may not always see the accountable. We may not always see the validation. We may not always see the justice. But we do know when we hold to Jesus and what he is going to do when he returns, that all of that will be held for account. That those perpetrators will stand before a righteous king and have to answer to the things they have done. I don't know about you, but that's good news, isn't it? That justice will one day be served. While some of us will get to see this justice in our life, on this side of heaven, others will not. All people like Xerxes, though, and his officials will ultimately one day have to stand before a loving God and answer to their crimes. And I believe that is a part of the ironic exposure of Xerxes that we saw in chapter 1, that we're seeing again here in chapter 2. Is that behind and beneath the scene here, underneath this paper, is a God who is telling them that you think you're a great king, Xerxes? You think you're great and just to do what you did? One day you will stand before me and be nothing. I think that's exactly what the Jewish writers are exposing in these great kings of the Old Testament. Kings who thought they had all power and might and wisdom, yet they were made as nothing compared to the God of Israel. So never forget, if you're walking through this, if you've been through this, if you have friends through this, God did not want those things to happen to you. The second point is God is with Esther amidst the exploitation. God is with Esther amidst the exploitation. This is an important thing because, again, he silently brings light into her dark situation, providing for her for the sake of things beyond even her understanding at this point. This is a key part of chapter 2. We were told 3 times in chapter 2 that Esther found favor with others. Favor. The term favor in Hebrew is a unique one. It's the Hebrew word chesed. Chesed. Some of you might remember that word. We've talked about it before. Chesed is the Hebrew word for unfailing love. Unfailing love or loving kindness. I think the author is pointing out in the midst of Esther's suffering and her exploitation, God's unfailing love was with her amidst the darkness in kind of a paradoxical way. That it's hard to necessarily see what she's going through and go, there's God's God's faithful love and unfailing love. That's exactly what we're seeing in her situation. That while he didn't rescue her from her circumstances, he made himself known to her. He made himself known to her. The Lord saw to it that Esther's life was not going to be defined by what Xerxes and the officials have seized from her. That her life was not going to be defined by the objectification and exploitation. God was not going to allow the Xerxes and those officials to ever be able to define Esther the way they wanted to define her. Instead, our God's unfailing love was going to give her a benefit. And those benefits, those favors, were going to put her into a position that would then allow her to bring rescue to those who she wouldn't even recognize or to know. This is a difficult perspective sometimes to play and to have in your mind, especially when you're going into the situation, when you're immersed in the situation. But it's exactly what God is doing here in her story. You know, just like Esther in her story, our sovereign Lord doesn't want how someone exploited you to define you. This is the power of our God, is he doesn't want those things that have been done to us to define us. He wants his unfailing love to redefine us and guide us into something far more powerful. And this is the history of the Christian movement, the history of the followers of Jesus can be found for 2,000 years in this very thing. Where a lot of our early, I call them ancestors because we're connected to these people. A lot of them were martyred and beat and subjected to terrible crimes. Yet they were never defined by those things. The church remembers them as people who stood up against things like injustice, who stood up for truth and paid prices for it. We might have a hard time seeing that as favor because they perished or they were abused or whatever it might be. But in the minds and hearts of those first believers, they were like, this is a blessing to stand before these people and represent our God in a way that will cost us. They celebrated this in the first generation of the followers of Jesus movement. That while these things are definitely going to always be a part of our story, it's far from the end of it. This is your introduction to Esther. Esther is far more than the objectification, exploitation that was done to her in this story. And I think that's exactly what we're supposed to be thinking about. Is this how her story begins? But it's definitely not how her story ends. It's definitely not how her story is ending. In fact, she is going to go way above this exploitation, objectification. I think of people like one of my personal heroes. You guys have probably heard of her, Rachel Denhollander. Rachel Denhollander. She's a follower of Jesus who was the first woman to publicly accuse U.S. gymnastics trainer Larry Nassar of sexual abuse. Very famous case in our country. In 2018, she made a victim impact statement addressing her abuse and systemic failures within the system that enabled it for so many years. It was her call for justice, and her statement and her ability and her courage of speaking out saved the lives of I don't know how many other young girls who would have experienced similar things. And her victim statement really was the seal in the capsule of what would be the maximum sentence for Larry Nassar. But what she says to him, I think, is impactful. As a follower of Jesus, she says this to him in the courtroom in 2018. This is just a part of it. If you want to go back and read her entire victim statement, it's actually really powerful. But this is a portion of it. She says to him, should you ever reach the point of truly facing what you have done, the guilt will be crushing. And that is what makes the gospel of Christ so sweet, because it extends grace and hope and mercy where none should be found, and it will be there for you. I pray you experience the soul-crushing weight of guilt so you may someday experience true repentance and true forgiveness from God, which you need far more than forgiveness from me, though I extend that to you as well. You think about that. What this young Rachel must have had to endure as someone that she would have thought would be someone she could trust. Yet years later, as she is the one who first sounds the alarms on his behavior, is now one of the first ones to really bring a transformative power of grace and forgiveness to someone that should never have accepted it in the ways of our world or even received it. I think her story is exceptionally powerful, and she is what I would say a connection to our modern day Esther. God took Rachel's abuse, something that would have grieved God's heart deeply, and he provided for her in a way where she could rescue other girls from his hands while also allowing her to see the justice seen and revealed for the women he exploited. Same as Esther will be doing in this story. The same God who was with Esther was with Rachel and is with you too. And this is so important. That when we read these stories, it's so easy to disconnect from it. But what we recognize is the same God who was immersed silently and almost in a hidden way in the story of Esther also sits here with us today. It sits with you in your own time. And I think that is such a great connection that we have, that we serve the same God yesterday, today, and forever. And this leads into some of the New Testament reflections, I think, of this type of a thought. One of the most famous passages in the Bible is Romans 8:28, written by Paul. He says this, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. And I can remember reading that as a young kid and just being like, how do we know? Is it like a blind faith, like when you talk to somebody who's just like doesn't really want to look at the information and they just go, I know because I know. What is he trying to say there? You know, and as I studied the Old Testament, I've studied stories like Esther, I start to realize that's how we know. We know, Paul knows because he's seen it done in the past. Esther is just another person that we know works out good for those who love him and have been called according to his purposes. And this is exactly what Paul does. If you go to read chapters 8 through 10, he's just reciting Israelite history, saying this is how we know. This is how we know God does this, because he's been doing it from the very beginning. We know because we have stories like Esther's. We know that he redefines and he transforms and he redirects and he refines us into people where the objectification, exploitation tried to steal and rob and destroy. God redeems and works through it for good purposes. She was the victim of sexual exploitation, yet God met her in his unfailing love, providing for her from behind the scenes, and called her to a greater purpose, more so than she could have ever imagined. She's going to end up being a crucial part in rescuing her people from Persian genocide of Israelites. If you don't know the story, that's exactly where this goes. The Persian rulers are persuaded by an official to kill all the Jews, and it's Esther, whose identity is still hidden from the king, who takes the first steps in saying that this is wrong. We cannot do this. That was God working out for good for those who love him and are called according to his purposes. That's exactly what our God does. That's exactly what our God does. The Bible is a collection of stories that proves Paul's statement to be a reality. And that's why it's so much fun to really enjoy in getting into and digging into is, it's dark. And, but because it's a book that's based within reality. Reality is dark, isn't it? It doesn't clean it up and try to make it, Sunday school material. It is a hard, dark, complex story that we look at in these scriptures. But in the same way, it brings to light those things that we deal with every single day, every single moment with people that we love, family members that we care for, and it points to us to a God who's also there with them, loving them in his unfailing love and grace and forgiveness and mercy. In our Lord, you could be the victim of terrible sexual exploitation, just like Esther was. Yet because of his unfailing love, your story may end as Esther's will, as the queen who saves her people from genocide. You just never know. Even though how your story begins, you never know how God is going to work through your story to the very end. When you look back and you recognize the pain and the suffering that you experienced, yet you see God's providence through the entirety of it to where you are years later looking back, recognizing exactly how far he brought you. And you talk to anybody who's followed Jesus for a chunk of time, they can tell you how real this is. That we go through this. You may not always feel it. You may not always experience it in the moment. There's going to be times you feel stagnant and you don't know where he is. But as you look years past, you start to recognize his hand in your life. You start to recognize his providence and his sovereignty, how he brought you about a different course than you would have ever expected to go. This is the beauty and the joy of following Jesus, is anything could happen to me. Anything, I have no control over what's going to happen to me tomorrow. But I do have a deep dependency and faith that no matter what it is that happens, that Jesus is going to somehow work through it for good. And maybe even the saving of many lives. And that is a powerful thing in our world, isn't it? And that's what it looks like to follow Jesus.